Hello viewers, Jason with Exploring History Together, and today we are at the Bristoe Station Heritage Park. I'm here with my friend Jeff Joyce, who is a volunteer here at the park and gives tours and things. And we're going to take a look at the 10th Alabama Cemetery today. I get asked a lot of questions about that, and I thought doing a video there would be a good thing to do. So Jeff, tell us a little bit about what you do here.
All right. Well, Jason, I'm a volunteer, a battlefield guide here at Bristoe Station. The park itself is run by Prince William County, and it is not just a park for people to walk their dogs and hike and run, but it also commemorates a number of Civil War activities. A lot of people don't realize that. In addition, there were two Civil War engagements here that occurred in August of 1862, what we refer to as the Battle of Kettle Run, which is a prelude to the Battle of Second Manassas. And then in October of 1863, the Battle of Bristoe Station, which was the culmination of Robert E. Lee's last strategic offensive against the Army of the Potomac. But in addition to those two engagements, which we usually focus on as part of our battlefield tours, there were also a number of encampments here. Initially, the Confederates had camps here in the summer and fall, winter of 1861, following the First Battle of Manassas. This camp was referred to as Camp Jones, which was named after a Confederate officer of the 4th Alabama that was killed at First Manassas. And then later on in the winter of 1863, 1864, Pennsylvania troops, Pennsylvania Reserve Division, were encamped here for the winter. They were here primarily to guard the Orange and Alexandria Railroad after the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Bristoe Station. So what we're going to do is kind of take you on a quick tour of the battlefield. We're going to focus on the 10th Alabama Cemetery, which is the only preserved cemetery associated with Camp Jones, and I'll explain a little more of the detail of why the Confederates were here, who are buried at the 10th Alabama Cemetery, and how we've striven to preserve that cemetery.
All right. Well, very good. Let's go take a look.
All right.
So we are on a walk of the battlefield today. So as we're on our way towards the cemetery, we came across this pile of logs here. And Jeff, tell us what's going on with this.
All right. Well, what you see in back of me is parts of a reconstructed winter hut. As I mentioned, in the winter of 1863, 1864, Pennsylvania troops were encamped here, primarily guarding the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. And several years ago, we had a Boy Scout Eagle project that created a replica winter hut. Unfortunately, over time, the logs had rotted, so we tore that down last year. And these logs were donated by the National Park Service for Manassas Battlefield, and we're in the process of rebuilding the reconstructed winter hut. So hopefully in the next couple months it'll be ready for visitors. And just to give you an idea, this is actually a photograph of a Confederate winter camp up in Centerville, which gives you a rough idea of what these winter huts would have looked like using whatever materials were available at that time.
What was the capacity for these 6-8 guys?
Yeah, typically a winter hut, about 6 to 8 on average. So, and they would use whatever wood was available. Sometimes rather than having a wooden roof, they would use a tent fabric, a tent canvas, if you will. And then they would scavenge whatever bricks, stones, etc. to build a fireplace, etc. So it was all makeshift, if you will, and very temporary. At the end of the winter, they would abandon the winter encampments, abandon the winter huts. Sometimes they'd burn them, other times they'd just leave them being and march away.
All right. I'll have to come back when that's all built up.
Yes. Okay. Well, as I mentioned earlier, following the First Battle of Manassas, Confederates camped throughout this area, and there were about 2 brigades worth of Confederates from the late summer through the beginning of the winter of 1861. They referred to this as Camp Jones. It was named after the commander of the 4th Alabama that had been killed at First Manassas. So if you can imagine looking around here, all of these trees would have been cut down, and there would have been just acres and acres of tents. This was not a winter camp. This was more of a temporary camp. And there were regiments from 5 different states, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. And so every camp or every regiment or state would have had typically a cemetery associated with that regiment or that state. And as disease was the biggest killer during the Civil War.
Sure.
More soldiers died of disease than died of combat wounds. And so every regiment lost a significant number of troops during the time they were camped here. Many of these soldiers had never been exposed to some of the diseases that they were exposed to, and meningitis, smallpox, measles, typhoid, etc. All of these were significant killers. So during the course of the Camp Jones, literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Confederate troops over a period of time died and are likely still buried here. In this area, we estimate there might have been a cemetery associated with the Mississippi troops, but we have not been able to uncover it. But over here to my left, in just a minute, we'll walk over and actually visit the one preserved cemetery associated with 10th Alabama.
Okay.
Well, we're at the entrance to what's referred to as the 10th Alabama Cemetery. As I mentioned, the 10th Alabama was one of a number of regiments that were camped here in the summer and fall of 1861. The 10th Alabama, they were established, or they were raised in northeast counties of northeast Alabama in 1861. They traveled to Virginia too late to see combat in the First Battle of Manassas, but from early August through late September, they were located here at Camp Jones. And we estimate probably about 80 of those soldiers died either while in camp here at Camp Jones or in the months afterwards when the 10th Alabama moved up to other camps near Centerville, as well as about a dozen plus died during a small engagement called the Battle of Drainesville in December of 1861. And even though the 10th Alabama had relocated after September, we believe that they continued to use this cemetery to bury their dead, both from disease and combat, at least through the end of 1861. And then in the spring of 1862, the 10th Alabama and all the other Confederate forces here were relocated south of the Rappahannock when General Johnson basically moved all of his troops further south and abandoned this area. So on my right is a marker that was placed here on the 150th anniversary of the establishment of Camp Jones by individuals that came up from Alabama. Some of them were actually descendants of soldiers that fought or that were part of the 10th Alabama. It's the only marker that we have here that's not associated with Prince William County, if you will. We're in the process of redoing many of the trail markers, so hopefully within the next 6 months, some of these trail markers will be replaced and updated. The marker to my left here lists approximately 40 names of 10th Alabama soldiers. These were burials that were recorded either during or immediately after the Civil War, but through research we've been able to identify double that number of soldiers that are likely buried here. So we estimate there are probably about 80 10th Alabama soldiers that are buried here from 1861.
Nice. I was reading about this one right here, Jesse Leatherwood, last night online. And in the past, I've provided well, not a grave photo, but a photo of this sign for Sidney Coleman's descendants.
Yeah, we actually have, at one time, we know that there was a flat stone marker for Leatherwood who died here, but that unfortunately disappeared about 30 odd years ago. We believe we know who has it, but we haven't been able to reacquire it as yet. So what would have happened was, during the course of their camp here, soldiers that died would have been buried here. If they had the resources available, they might have put them in a simple wood coffin. Most likely, in a lot of cases, they were just wrapped in blankets and buried here. And they remained here. Unlike Union soldiers that were moved to national cemeteries after the end of the Civil War, Confederate soldiers were pretty much left where they were buried.
Right.
And it was a responsibility of private organizations, family members, or the states themselves to relocate those soldiers, say, to private cemeteries like the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, for example.
Okay.
So here's a photograph that I'll show you. It's a similar Centerville winter camp that I showed you earlier, but it shows you, this was also taken in the spring of 1862 after the Confederates had abandoned this area. You can see the graves, the temporary graves that were for for Confederate soldiers that were buried there at Centerville, and it's likely that the 10th Alabama Cemetery looked very similar to this in 1861, 1862, just using simple wooden headboards that had been used, that were probably from crates and boxes, etc., with names, regiments, dates of death stenciled on them. But as you can imagine, over time, many of those wooden headboards disappeared.
Sure.
When Union soldiers came through here in 1862, 1863, they recorded about 70 names of, or recorded or identified about 70 graves here based on the number of headboards. And then in 1883, a local pastor from Manassas visited the cemetery. There were about 40 of those markers still in existence. And these names that you see here on the marker were primarily from what he recorded on his visit. He wrote a letter to a newspaper in Alabama listing the number of names. And then one of the veterans of the 10th Alabama, whose brother had been killed at the Battle of Drainesville and was likely buried here, returned in 1909, visited the cemetery. But at that time, most of the headboards had either disappeared or you couldn't read the writing on them. So you had no way of identifying where his brother was buried.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Well, we're inside the 10th Alabama Cemetery, and as we kind of move around, you'll notice that at one time we had a split rail fence that had been put there by Boy Scouts. It's been torn down. It'll be replaced eventually. But this is the burial ground for the 10th Alabama soldiers. And if you look closely, we're fortunate that we had recent rains. You can see the depressions in the ground, and each of these depressions represents one or more graves of 10th Alabama soldiers. You can see they were buried kind of in a row. Again, we estimate that's probably around 80 soldiers are buried here from that time frame. Most of the markers would have been wooden markers, which have disappeared over time. There were also a number of flat stone markers that were engraved. Unfortunately, those have disappeared as well. But we do have one marker over here that still remains here. It's not an engraved marker, so it's possible it was a foot marker, or it was in addition to a wooden a head marker or a head marker that has since disappeared. Unfortunately, there's no engraving, so we have no idea who is buried here. One of the soldiers that was a member of the 10th Alabama was a soldier by the name of Bailey George McClellan, and after the war, he wrote a book called Seeing the Elephant, and he describes the time that he was here. Here's a photograph of McClellan, Private George McClellan. He was 21 years old at the time he enlisted in 1861. He was a school teacher, and he was wounded at Sharpsburg, or Antietam, in 1862, captured at Gettysburg, but he survived the war. He lived until 1925, died at the age of 85 years old, and is buried in Alabama in Calhoun County. As I mentioned, he wrote this book. It's one of the only first-person accounts that we have of the 10th Alabama. And he writes about the time that the 10th Alabama was here. He says, "The death roll and discharges for disability at Bristow reduced our ranks considerably. Burial of the dead was a daily occurrence at Bristow. Military homage was paid to the remains of each departed soldier by the comrades discharging a musketry volley over the grave of the deceased at the internment. Reports of musketry could be heard throughout the camping grounds of the entire brigade, and it was a signal well understood." And then he lists those of his company, Company D of the 10th Alabama, that were buried here.
Wow.
So,
I'm going to have to get a copy of that book.
yeah. Okay. Well, over the time that we've done research on the soldiers that are buried here, we've been fortunate to acquire pictures of at least 2 of the soldiers that we believed are buried here. Unfortunately, we don't know for sure because the name of the soldiers are not included in the list of 40 or odd soldiers that the pastor in 1883 recorded and sent back to a newspaper in Alabama. However, based on military records that they died here at Bristoe Station and they were likely buried here, we believe that they are in fact still resting here. And one of those soldiers is this individual. This is Private Carter Tatum. He was 18 years old. He was a salesman when he enlisted in Company G of the 10th Alabama. And on August 27th, 1861, just a few weeks after the 10th Alabama had moved here, he died of meningitis, or as they referred to it as brain fever.
Mm.
So we believe he's buried here. What's interesting is his younger sister, Nancy, went by the name of Nanny, and she kept pictures of Carter. And if you look at this picture of Nanny, it was taken after the Civil War in the late 1860s, and on her hand is a book. That's actually a photo album.
Oh, yeah.
That book now belongs to Nanny's great-great-granddaughter, who lives in Midland, Texas. And she provided this picture to us of Nanny,
Nice.
as well as this picture of Carter. So it's kind of it's sad, but also humbling to put a picture to a name that we often see listed as having died here, but we don't have a face to associate or a history to associate with that
Sure.
that individual. So
what a nice thing to have,
Yeah.
though.
So
And
okay. As I mentioned, the only cemetery that remains from Camp Jones that we've been able to identify and preserve is the 10th Alabama Cemetery. But we know that there were cemeteries associated with other regiments that were here in 1861. We know the Mississippi Cemetery is somewhere in this local area, but even though we've done some archaeological research, we have not been able to identify it or locate it. And part of that is just because of the fact that this land was farmed in the years after the Civil War. The development that you see here, these townhomes were built in the 2000 time frame. The Prince William County reached an agreement with the developer to preserve 130 acres of the battlefield, which is why we still have Bristoe Station Battlefield, including the 10th Alabama Cemetery, preserved today.
all right.
All right. Well, thank you, Jason, for the opportunity to show you the 10th Alabama Cemetery. I will mention that in addition to the two battles that occurred here, Camp Jones as well as the Union encampment, there's actually a private cemetery on in the park. It's the Robertson Cemetery. After the end of the Civil War, Thomas Davis, who owned this property during the Civil War, sold much of it due to financial issues. He was actually a Union sympathizer, wasn't well liked in the community, as you can imagine. So he sold much of the property to the Robertson family, which farmed it for decades after that, and they established a family cemetery, the Robertson Cemetery, first burial in the 1870s, 1880s, all the way up to, we think, the 1930s. And I believe you've actually have a video on that cemetery that you can show.
And I will link that up so that anybody wants to go look at it, you can see it. That cemetery is, I believe, in that direction.
It's over in that direction, on the far corner of the battlefield.
A long walk from where we're standing right
Yes.
now. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate your time and coming out here and doing this with us. And hopefully we can do some other sites in the
Yes.
coming months.
Very good.
Appreciate
I
it.
look forward to it.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.